Take out your little devices that make noises and beep and turn them off. You guys too. All right? Any questions before we actually get started? Great. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our live audience here in San Francisco and our radio and online audiences. It's my great pleasure to introduce the panel here today to discuss the power of critical thinking. So, as our moderator, we have Roy Eisenhart, who is a professor of law at UC Berkeley and has done many, many of these for the Commonwealth Club over the years. And we also have Leland Faust, who is a former chairman, CSI Capital Management, and the author of A Capitalist Lament, How Wall Street is Fleecing You and Ruining America. He didn't pull any punches in his title. And Richard Kahn, managing partner of Innovate Partners, international attorney, Russia expert, board member of International Crisis Group, advisor to chess champion Magnus Carlsen, and the author of The Earthbound Parent, How and Why to Raise Your Little Angels Without Religion. Richard and I discovered we have nearly repeated each other's lives here. I mean, him about 10 years after mine, but went to the same college, studied the same things, had the same professors, went to the same places, ended up in New York City doing legal stuff.
My long-lost older brother.
So, without further ado, Roy, thank you very much for leading the discussion tonight.
Well, thank you, George. Everybody here? Okay, good, because I can't. My head is completely stuffed, so I'm going to read lips the whole night. This is a fascinating topic, I think, and the axis of it, both vertically and horizontally, is deep and wide. And what we're going to do is hopefully get some insights into what we intuitively know is lacking in much of our discourse, not just today, but probably forever back in time. So I thought a good place to start to get both you and Richard, you and Leland going is an experience that each of you have had that's demonstrated the use or the non-use of critical thinking in a large problem-solving context. And Richard, I'll start with you because I heard in your introduction that you are a Russia expert, so I'm going to channel your answer perhaps into something in that range of your experience.
Thanks so much, Roy, and
Sure.
Thanks for doing this, incidentally. And George, thanks for having us here. There are other people I want to thank, but I'll get to that a little bit later. The story that I guess I would relate demonstrates probably more than anything my own lack of critical thinking and lack of understanding, which, as my wife can tell you, is a common theme in my life. This demonstrates, in my view, the use of assumptions and how little we understand about other cultures and how other people think. It is a true story, and I haven't told it. It's been long enough, I think I can. Back in 1993, I was doing a lot of work with Yeltsin's team in Russia and was living there for quite a while. And I was asked got a call from the deputy mayor of Moscow, a guy named Ordzhonikidze, who subsequently they had like 3 assassination attempts on this guy because he was running all the casino business and the hotels for Moscow. And his team passed along to me that they wanted me to come to host a luncheon, and have a couple of other people attend from the Western community who were leaders of the community and who also spoke fluent Russian, so that we could talk about how to attract capital to Moscow. That was the theme. And as you may remember, back in those days, we were all friendly with Russia and we were trying to help them integrate into the West. So I said, sure, not understanding anything as usual. And so I show up at this lunch with the head of Citibank for Russia and the guy who ran a big telecom company. And the first thing that Ordzhonikidze says to me, as we're sitting at one of these formal tables across from one another, after maybe a minute of formality, was Moscow wants 50% of every deal that we do in Russia, meaning as I started to pull it together in my mind, he had in his mind that by talking to the 3 of us, that he could do a deal with the West and that would bind anyone else in the West doing business. And so the first thing, that sort of light bulb that goes on is, okay, from his frame of reference, being of the Soviet generation, you went to Moscow to do deals, you dealt with the government, there was no free market concept. So he had no clue that we're sitting there just as guys from our specific companies and have obviously no authority whatsoever. So I thought I gave a diplomatic answer, which was, we'd be delighted to see Moscow participate in every deal. The way we do it, though, in the West is by this thing called taxation. And so what we can all do for you is work with Moscow to help set up a tax structure so you can participate. And I went through this little song and dance of how we're more comfortable having you as a government playing the role of a referee in a soccer game rather than being on our team. And he politely listened to this thing for 3 or 4 minutes, at which point I stopped to get his reaction. He looked at me and he said, "How about 25%?" And what that told me as I thought about it was, okay, he thinks nobody is as naive as I am as to actually be genuinely negotiating this thing.
Right.
And so his immediate reaction was he puts himself in my mind and thinks, okay, this is what I would do. And so to me, it's one of countless examples I could give you in terms of being in situations where you think you're utilizing your critical thinking, but you're actually making assumptions about how other people think. So with that, I'll pass the ball to you, Leland, to give something perhaps a bit more normal.
Well, at least mine will be domestic. Well, one incident that I was involved with a few years ago, which I think demonstrates a lot of sort of wishful thinking, meaning you're hoping for that what you think is reality and it's not. And therefore it's going to happen. And of course the question is, what's reality? And I owe this definition to a quote one of my cousins added to her emails tagline, which she sends me every one. It says, "Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, is still there." And that works. Anyway, people just choosing to disregard what would seem to be critical analysis, even when other people in a similar circumstance have said it is. So, a number of years ago, the California pension fund, the CalPERS, the biggest pension fund in America, probably the world, decided, and I believe rightly, and when you read my book you'll see why, decided they were going to stop investing in hedge funds, that it wasn't paying off at all. Just as they were doing that, the city of San Francisco announces that they're going to, for the first time, go into hedge funds. So I was rather stunned as a taxpayer in San Francisco, and also as to disclose all conflicts as the husband of a San Francisco pensioner. And so I contacted members of all the members of the board, pension board, and gave them all the facts and figures. And I also sent them to the administrator, the paid administrator of the fund. Now, at that time, I did not know his salary. As you're going to see, it's become relevant. I have subsequently learned that he's the highest paid employee in the city of San Francisco. He makes about $500,000 a year. So I said, help me. I've given you all these statistics, all kinds of them, study after study after study. And I said, what don't I understand? What's wrong with my figures? He said, I don't have any problem with your figures. He said, but we can pick the good hedge funds. So I said, really? I said, if you could do that, whatever your salary is, I'll pay you 10 times as much to come work for me. And so, the jury might still be out, but after the first year and a half, the hedge funds were trailing the other types of investments which the pension funds in San Francisco do. So again, this is wishful thinking, not critical thinking, and it really has a significant impact because it means one of two things are going to happen. Either the pensioners are going to get less or the taxpayers are going to pay more, and there's no third way.
What was his incentive to disbelieve the facts that you gave him?
The disincentive was that the pension fund didn't have enough money in it to completely fund the pensions. So by earning a higher rate of return, they were hoping they could catch up and not have a shortfall sometime in the future. So instead of saying these are not the real numbers, but we're going to earn 5% of our money, we're going to go for 8 or 9.
Right.
If we can get that, then we won't have the shortfall. Failing to do the critical thinking that risk and return are
Yeah,
correlated.
yeah. The fact he might not get 8 or 9. Yeah. Because that raises, I mean, Richard, you've inserted the term assumption into our dialogue here, and that's a really important part of it. I remember there was author, some of you may remember, Douglas Adams, he mainly wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide, The Galaxy, and things like that. But he had one great phrase. He says, the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we don't know we're making. And it's always stuck with me because in both of your examples, there were assumptions that they didn't even realize they were making. And you cannot critically think if you don't know what's attacking you in your process. Leland, you brought up the term knowing what's real, what's reality, and so forth. And I think that also is an interesting concept. And Richard, when I was reading your book, one of the discussions that intrigued me was your discussion of Plato's cave. And many of you probably have read that in your philosophy classes and so forth. And I think it's worth revisiting that story, I'll call it, because it really pertains to our discussion tonight.
Yeah, it's a useful sort of overview of what I wrote about.
Yeah.
And Plato's Cave basically tells a tale of people who are chained to a bench for their entire lives, unable to turn around and see that the shadows that they're observing on the wall in front of them, and the only reality that they can see in their lives, is actually merely the reflection of from a fire burning brightly behind them, which is putting up shadows of people who are living, going about their lives. And so it provides a metaphor for the idea that the truth that we assume we have in our lives may in fact be merely shadows, that we're not thinking about what really is going on, and we're simply making the assumption that what is before us is all there is. And I use that in the book to begin the discussion of the place of whether it's wishful thinking, or I do use the term delusional, which I apologize for, the concept of people embracing the supernatural, notwithstanding our physical place in the universe and our knowledge about that, as well as our own psychological makeups, which lead us to want to embrace a supernatural being in order to deal with our own fears and desires. So I do think it's a useful tool to recognize that all of us have to question whether what we're seeing and thinking is simply a truth that's been provided to us by our parents or grandparents, or whether it is in fact a reality.
Yeah.
And also how it affects our lives if we don't question that.
Yeah. And that's what you were talking about before, Leland, about finding reality, and how many people attended my inauguration. Well, we can all find our own reality of what the right answer is. And we realize how much we talk by each other in in trying to overwhelm the other side with facts, because they have different set of facts. Which takes me, Leland, to sports, which is an area that you, at least as an avocation, operate in quite often. And give us some examples of occasions that you've encountered there where the challenge between the wishful thinking of people involved in sports and the critical thinking of people who are observing it maybe don't meet.
Well, I think there's a huge number of cases that we could find or examples. I mean, a couple that I think stand out to me. One is certainly the obsession over the drafts in at least the
All sports.
All sports. This is somehow going to equalize the playing field. The fans have bought into this as if it is a reality, and it's, in my view, I think it can be demonstrated statistically and with probabilities that have been worked out, completely wishful thinking and hopeful thinking. A number of years ago, I represented a team owner, and I asked him the same kind of question. How do you spend, this was before they had the salary cap for rookies in the NBA, the basketball. I said, how can you owners justify drafting college players who've never played against the real professionals and paying them, because they're the super high draft picks, more than even many of the all-stars make? And he said, his response was kind of interesting. He said, well, we all have two delusions. I said, really, what are they? He said, number one, we all delude ourselves that we're just one player from having the championship team. And he said, and two, we all delude ourselves that we can pick them based on how they played in college. And it just isn't true. And the proof of that, for the last 32 years in the NBA, someone did a study of how many of the top 4 draft picks, so that's 128, no, pardon me, top 4 for 32 years, yes, 128 players, pardon me, played on a championship team by those who drafted them. And the answer is that of the 128 players that were going to change the franchises, 3 played on championship teams. So it's an illusion. Another one, which my wife is going to kill me for mentioning, is the closer in baseball. Yeah. People get all excited about the closer coming in to save the game. Well, I don't have time to go into the details now, but if you look at the statistics on the closers, they have almost no influence on the game statistically. And a couple of quick examples. I believe the greatest closer in the history of baseball was a Yankee named Mariano Rivera. He was the best pitcher to ever close, has all the records, and I think he was the best closer. In the 5 years since he's been retired, the Yankees' close percentage is higher. So that pretty much tells it, and I could quote a lot of it, but there are a couple of quick sports examples.
No, it's interesting to me that what you're saying is that industry basically rejects critical thinking in their analysis and goes with custom and what seems safe to them.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are certain things that have been suggested certainly that I've seen in baseball and football that statistically would improve your chances of winning over the season a lot. And no one will do them because they're afraid if they do and it doesn't work, they'll get fired. It's the old, what they said, 40 years ago, no purchasing agent ever got fired for buying an IBM machine. Well, it's sort of the same kind of thing. Yeah. And so I think that's part of it. I think that but I think some of it is in fact, wishful thinking that, our one guy will save us, or I can identify, we can hire a manager who can identify the secret sauce. Right. And it's not quite that simple. So you see that, repeatedly.
I've got an idea, by the way, for a movie, if we could get Brad Pitt and maybe do something involving baseball.
About
having to do
Moneyball or something.
Maybe something like that.
Yeah. Which takes me to chess, because you've worked with Garry Kasparov, right?
I have.
How do you see his thinking style working in this anti-intellectual world that we live in?
It's interesting you start with Garry, because I thought about Garry at various points when I wrote the book, as well as other people whom I admire for their intelligence, yet have some religious leanings or spiritual side to them, because it always struck me that what Dawkins and Hitchens did in their writings, which were quite hostile towards people who embrace religion, didn't quite capture the way I think of it, which is more of we're all in this together, dealing with our psychological needs to address our concerns in life and fears in particular. And Garry, he does have a side to him that is spiritual. He identifies with the Jewish faith in particular, although that's more, in part more cultural, but there is an element there. Gary, as well as Karpov, whom I ran with, for the FIDE leadership positions, as well as Magnus, whom I still have dealings with, and another great guy. They all share the ability, obviously, to think in a logical, organized manner. They all, I think, share a certain humility that comes from seeing how difficult it is to do that and seeing how many mistakes they make, even with all the work they put into it. But they all embrace it. I embrace critical thinking, that is, and they honor that. Chess players at that level honor the concept of truth, meaning, as they would probably express it, and again, I'm not nearly at their level, but the way they talk about it is they're looking for the truth in a position, trying to figure it out. And, I see a buddy, Greg Hilberg, over here nodding his head, who's a very strong speed player. And you are, as you play more chess, you're just trying to figure it out. It's not so much that you're trying to win. It's almost a mixture of art and science. You're actually trying to get to the heart of the reality of a position you're analyzing, and then trying to control your mind and concentrate to be able to do that, which is a much harder thing to do than most of us realize. We generally live with the illusion that we're extremely smart and that humanity is just fabulous in every possible way. Well, if you play chess, you will quickly realize how foolish and stupid we all are. It's extremely difficult to concentrate even for a couple moves and look ahead. And the greatest grandmasters like Gary make mistakes. But Gary's an interesting example of being able to sort of hold on to some spirituality, but at the same time be a critical thinker in other areas.
Well, we're using this term as though it has a monolithic meaning. Maybe we ought to talk about a little bit what we mean by critical thinking, and a sub part of that for me is whether it's something that you acquire or it can be taught or both. So either one of you, when you say you need to learn critical thinking skills, what do you mean?
Well, I think the closest I can do it in a few words is sort of objective analysis and evaluation based on facts. That's about as close as I can come in a few words. That you're trying, and it's excruciatingly difficult not to be biased. So you start out with trying to be objective. You're trying to analyze, get from the proverbial point A to point B, and it's not necessarily clear at all what the route should be. And so, and then evaluate it again based on reality, not based on what you think. You can't, the obvious. You can't send a rocket to the moon and put it in orbit if you have the wrong fact of how strong gravity is.
Yeah.
And you can't wish that away. And I think that applies in human things too. You can't wish that every voter who goes into a voting booth is going to have rationally analyzed the candidates and say, whose policies really will make us richer, safer, whatever. You say, who do I feel closest to? So that's no longer critical thinking then. And I think it's so hard to do it. So that's the best I can do. Richard, what do you think?
I could add. I mean, I agree with how you're describing it. I would also add the dimension that, to me, a sort of, if you will, a contrast of critical thinking that might illuminate what it is if one embraces tribalism and identity, whether it's from a religious context or a political one, and one doesn't think about positions. In other words, if you're able to go through, a series of positions and say, here's X, here's Y, and I support this, but I don't support that, but your view changes based on identity politics if suddenly the X is a blue and the Y is a red or vice versa. That, to me, smacks of lack of critical thinking, and that comes out, and as I write in the book, more clearly than in most areas if one simply takes the view that, look, I'm tied with this faith or that, or I have a certain label on me that makes me a better person than you, or gives me reason to treat you badly, or to, in some cases, do you bodily injury, that to me is yet another example of a choice to embrace something other than critical thinking, which is in part wishful thinking or delusional thinking, and that to me is one way to think of the antithesis of what critical thinking is.
How do we solve the problem of facts? Because, as you know, the old saying, you're entitled to your opinions, but not your own set of facts. But it strikes me that, going back to Plato's cave, which is why I wanted to talk about that what we may be sitting here thinking that each of us is critically thinking, but we're operating on different assumptions, unconscious biases. So the notion of a pure concept of the facts, it strikes me as a bit of a existential problem.
Well, sometimes that's clearly going to be the case, but sometimes I think it's not, and especially in an area where it's been near and dear to me just because I grew up with a facility for it, which is math and arithmetic and, that type of thing. And so often we find people trying to analyze a situation or a policy, and the numerical facts are just totally off base, and the critical thinking might get us there to just establish what might be a fact or a non-fact. And there was a recent letter to the editor in the Chronicle, which I think, to me, illustrated this problem with something which clearly, in my mind, isn't a fact. And that letter was probably the 200th letter in the last 3 years that they've published about the border wall that Trump wants to build and increase. And unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, for making the case in this instance, the author of the letter said something like, and I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to be close enough. He said, it's either I calculated or I believe that the cost per American in building this wall is $4,000. Well, $4,000 times 330 million Americans is $1.3 trillion. So it's off by at least a factor of 100. Now, we can talk about what the policy should be, but we can't critically think about it if the facts are off by a factor like that.
Right. That's my point. That's the vulnerability. I don't think too many people will say, well, I don't like critical thinking. It's too much work. I think most of us think we are critically thinking, but the fact is we are allowing it to be persuaded by preconceptions, unconscious biases, assumptions about how much a border wall costs. So it strikes me that that's where I find trouble, for example, in teaching. As was said in the introduction, I teach at the law school, and one of the things you teach in law schools, like it or not, is critical thinking. And I have trouble figuring out how to take students from the step of knowing what something says and being able to regurgitate back to me what I've said the week before versus critically analyze what was said. That's a level that I think we as educators and grandparents fall short. Where do we go with that?
Well, it's a controversial subject. I was asked recently to speak at my alma mater at Dartmouth at one of our reunions, which will be coming up this summer. 3 classes get together, and I'll be talking about the book, and particularly critical thinking. But there is a discussion there of how controversial this is, even in a major academic setting, because of the contrast between critical thinking and what we're talking about today, which are the biases, the teams, the concepts that we should not employ our critical thinking at all in challenging our place in the universe, how we relate to each other, because of this broad set of religious beliefs that are shared by people throughout the world, although they have different names for them. And so I found it rather interesting to see that discussion take place at a major institution. Can we actually have a discussion about whether critical thinking is a good thing? May I advocate for critical thinking? And we'll see where it comes out. I'm sure I will speak there, but I'm not sure how prominent the forum will be, and whether there'll be a pastor or a minister who would like to, sort of
Rebut.
have a discussion, a friendly discussion about it. And so I do think it's a live issue, and it's not one where you can just sort of assume that everybody embraces that, at least in terms of some of the most important issues that we all wrestle with, which is our own identity and place in society and in the world.
Leland, you have mentioned your book several times, and I want to turn to it because I think you use in several places examples of where investment analysts, investment bankers, whatever title we want to put them, maybe operate on their own set of assumptions about, you talked about the hedge fund, for example, and the ability to beat the market. Give us some examples from your experience on how our stock market is structured to really set critical thinking to the side and behave based on tradition and assumptions.
Well, I think there's maybe a difference between how the free enterprise system in the stock market, behaves, or would behave in a more rational system, and how it does. I think that's a problem that we're facing today because the system has been abused and critical thinking hasn't been applied enough. It's given a bad name to a system that otherwise would function a whole lot better. So I want to sort of start from that position. So, but people who are involved in the industry, and many that represent some of the most prominent and largest firms, have an incentive for you not to engage in critical thinking. They engage in criminal thinking.
Yeah. There's an
Someone
unconscious bias.
yes, absolutely.
Very subtle.
Very, very, very subtle, Dr. Freud. Anyway, so if they can make more money by puffing up a person who doesn't really know anything much more than anybody else on Wall Street, but can pretend that he is and get you to avoid critically thinking about it and accept it, then that's going to help them, because then they can promote him or her. They can promote the products that he or she is presenting and make more profit. So if they can create a superstar out of nowhere because there's no critical thinking, no one's analyzing this, let's put them to the test. What did they say? Not what did they say 3 times, what did they say every time? So we can analyze not the 3 that they cherry pick, but what they really said and really did. Then we'll get a different result. And it wouldn't even take great critical thinking to get there. But there's this whole abandonment of that. One of my favorite examples, and it's more extreme, and I cite it in the book, is the interaction between baseball, Len Dykstra, who was an all-star baseball player, led the Mets to the World Series championship, James Kramer, who has the biggest audience by far on cable financial, and Wall Street. Well, at one point, Kramer teamed up with Len Dykstra, who he said was one of the best minds in Wall Street, and immediately when they started selling a Dykstra newsletter, they sold in the first week like $1 million worth of subscriptions. Now, interestingly enough, in an interview while he was still playing, about 15 years into his career, they said, "Len, why are you such a good hitter?" And he said, "Well, I'm really careful of my eyesight, and since I've been in baseball, I haven't read." Now,
we're fortunate he didn't just decide to run for the presidency.
Yeah,
that's right. So I guess we shouldn't bother going to business school if this turns you into one of the greatest minds on Wall Street. Well, fast forward, a couple of years, and Dykstra himself is in bankruptcy and in jail. But this didn't stop Jim Cramer from endorsing him this way. It didn't stop Jim Cramer for being interviewed and said, what's your favorite one stock? And he named the stock, which proceeded to fall 50% in 1 year and 95% over 2. And this is 15 years or more ago, and he's still the best watched person on cable finance. So you get these people have the incentive to mislead. They don't want you to think critically, because if you did, you would say, my God, what's going on here?
Yeah. When you talk about that, what flashes before my mind is Theranos.
Indeed.
Isn't that a perfect example of
Yeah,
ignoring the facts?
absolutely.
Well, seems to me it's a perfect example of wishful thinking in every which way,
Yeah.
including the most basic. Never mind, is their thing going to be the best? Are they going to get it to market in time? Are the economics going to work? But the wishful thinking, and that's all it can be, I can't think of any other explanation, that a 19-year-old college dropout can figure out what every PhD and university professor and every major drug company in the world hasn't been able to even come close to.
Right.
What I find interesting, though, in part as we talk about wishful thinking, is just how much we all seem to need that. That is part of our emotional makeup, that we have to have this in mind. And I'm reminded, I just will share very quickly, of a conversation I had with one of my children, with my a 5-year-old. I've got 4 kids, and the last one sort of said to me when she was 5 and going to sleep, she was afraid of dying. And she brought up that topic and asked me what happens and that sort of thing. And most parents or grandparents face that at some stage. And I thought, this is a moment where I can impart sort of wishful thinking to her, and I can talk about a magic blanket. So you don't have to worry, honey, just go to sleep. You're covered with this blanket or pillow. Or if it were a different religion, it's the magic pillow. But obviously I'm using that as an example of something you can create, some mythology that does deal with the short-term issue. But instead, I said 12 words to her, and she has never brought up the subject again, and has seemed very comfortable. And it always struck me as an example of how critical thinking actually can, if we try, address the areas that have been dealt with in a more wishful concept, such as that there is immortality. Don't worry, you're actually never going to die, or you will live forever, with all of your friends, which is obviously the wishful thinking that is at the heart of most religious philosophies. And so the 12 words were, and see if it works for you, it will be just the way it was before you were born.
Yeah.
And I've yet to meet somebody who said to me, that doesn't do it for me. I'm still terrified. And maybe some of you will say it since we're being videoed here, and it'll have an impact. But I'm fascinated by our innate need to sort of deal with these things, and then we have this long history of dealing with them in a manner that incorporates wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Pardon me, on the subject of the wishful thinking and living forever, I stumbled across this statement that I'm going to quote in a minute, and when I did, it's one of the times in my life I said, darn, why couldn't I have thought of it that way? It's so great. And everybody wants to live forever. And the assumption, and Roy, as you were saying, there are assumptions that we all make when we say things. And the assumption is we're going to live forever. It's going to be, this traditional concept of heaven, or it's going to be the best days of our lives. And they said, what if you were going to be living forever? You could not die no matter what. And so the first 5 minutes into that, you walked into the field, tripped, fell into the bottom of the well, and you couldn't get out forever.
Well, that's one way to look at it.
I was feeling pretty upbeat until just,
Yeah, I bet if you looked up wishful thinking on some Google dictionary, a synonym would be hope. And we don't We don't think hope is bad, right? But
No.
what I think the difference is the context in which we use it. Let's go to the audience questions because we've got some time, and
Right.
I trust that there will be quite a few. Let me say one thing as gently as I can. Please ask a question because everybody else here may want to ask a question also, and the quicker they are, the more we can get in. So,
May I interject one thing before we
Sure.
do that? I just want to do one huge thank you to an old buddy of mine in Leland's who really is responsible for pulling all this together. He introduced us. He suggested the whole concept. He also helped me figure out calculus when we were in college together years ago, although I never really figured it out. And he is the head of Brea Capital here in San Francisco. He even went so far as to sponsor this thing along with his partners. So I just wanted to say thanks to Steve Cutcliffe,
Yeah.
who's over here, and his colleagues, Bill and Dave and Bill, his partners who are here. Just really wonderful of them to do it and to get us together.
yeah. Good.
Good. And I'd like to remind our radio and online audiences that they're listening to Roy Eisenhart moderate a question about the power of critical thinking with Mrs. Foss and Kahn, and we're going to go to the questions.
Thank you. Mr. Faust, this is particularly a question for you because you brought up statistics earlier, but I'd also be interested in the other gentleman's observations. I've often wondered about why people don't respond to statistics, and I see it as kind of two ways. First, the personal relationship with statistics, like don't like them, don't understand them, don't have the patience for them. And the second one is that perhaps people don't trust either the source of the statistics or the veracity of the statistics. So what do you think about why people don't respond to statistics?
Well, my thought would be it's a number of things. First of all, I think many people are uncomfortable with sort of math in general. That everybody in the room here has a different sort of natural predisposition for it, and then they were exposed to different educational backgrounds. I certainly believe that if one has anything in the normal range, if you then study it, whether it's statistics or history or English or foreign language, you can get really good at it. You're not going to be the best in the world, but you're going to be good at it. But I think there's probably been a lack of that. So people feel a little uncomfortable with sort of the math aspects in general. And really understanding statistics, I think, takes a kind of a next step up. It's not just simple necessarily high school arithmetic that or algebra even. That gets you a long way there. But it's been putting it in context, what does statistics mean and the exposure to it, so that when you hear something about whatever, the unemployment rate, or you hear something about a baseball statistic, or you hear something about, the development of artificial intelligence and the statistics, that you can kind of move quickly from one to the other. And I think that's a real problem. Then we lay on top of it a couple of things. One, that people, what are the underlying statistics? Are they real, or are they being manufactured? How many? If someone says this disease affects 1 person in 100, what does that mean? What's affect 1 person in 100, right? And I think that's what you're going. Part of your question. So I think that's part of it. And then it gets worse because people try to use the statistics to support the position that they want to take. And a recent example, and one for a week ago, I couldn't have told you what I'm about to tell you, but it was an example of a true statistic, but was put in to lead you to think something was a lot worse than it is. Okay, I just went to see the movie called Just Mercy. I liked it a lot. It's the story of Brian Stevenson, who was a Harvard-educated African-American lawyer who goes back to the South to start a justice program to get people released from death row who didn't commit the crimes. And it's dramatizes one particular story among others. But at the end of the movie, it says, for every person in America who is executed, for every 9 people who are executed, 1 is released from death row because he was wrongfully committed. Now, the first reaction is, oh my God, we're wrongfully committing 10% of the people, right? 1 person is exonerated for every 9 who are executed. But that's not what's really going on here. We don't execute very many people. I didn't know the number, so I looked it up. Last year in the United States, 22 people were executed. So if it were 1 in 9, that meant 2.5 people last year on average were exonerated from death row. I then looked up how many people are on death row, 2,625 approximately. So it goes from 1 in 10 to 1 in 1,000. So again, since it's played with, it then gives the use of statistics, a bad name. And so I think that's part of it.
I would only add one quick thought, which is I think most of us are wired to emotionally connect with something and to want to hear stories and to put things in a context, a narrative. And I think it's difficult for the vast majority of us to relate emotionally to statistics and to sort of picture that. I think, for example, of the efforts we make, I'm on an advisory board of a group called First Move, which has taught chess to 1.5 million second and third graders in the U.S. I do it through video, and actually Wendy Fisher's here, who's the chair of that and executive president of it. And this not-for-profit tries to bring to life chess, with color, with characters, so that children, ages, 5 to 10, have something they can relate to. It was not quite as cold. So I think that's also part of the reason it's difficult.
To go back to Plato for just 1 second, he had this crazy idea besides the cave of, in order to prepare people to be political leaders, that they had to study math for 20 years. Because it would make them critical thinkers. It would make them think rationally.
He was ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Thank you. My question is around measurement. I mean, I know, like any other skill, if we are somehow able to measure the critical thinking, we'll be able to manage it and grow it and make it better. Like in this room, how can we put a number and say, okay, at this level, the critical thinking is here, now it is here. Like any other 21st century skills, critical thinking is one of them. Angela Duckworth came up with a book, Grit, in which she came up with something called Grit Scale. So in your research, have you come across anything, how we can really put some ballpark number on it numerically and then over a period of time see whether it is growing or is it just remaining there?
After you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I was really hoping somebody would ask that question.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah. Well, I do have a measuring device here, and it has gone up during the meeting today. Everybody is thinking much more critically. It's very difficult, obviously, to measure something like that, because the first thing is what is critical thinking? Roy has raised that. There are all sorts of measures of that. People debate IQ tests, whatever, all sorts of measures. In the chess context, you can go online and see how well you do and watch your critical thinking skills diminish as you have a beer or as you get more tired at night. You actually can see your scores dropping. And so that's one small indication anyway of the physicality of critical thinking. But as I mentioned, it's such a controversial subject in terms of even having critical thinking in schools. I mentioned one situation, but I'm trying to get it into school districts as an area to focus on. And again, it's highly controversial because of the parenting aspects that come up, and whether you're crossing over too much into areas where people feel the critical thinking skills should not be utilized. So I don't think it's an area where we really have measurement yet. I think we're really at the sort of the forefront of that right now, and at least we're trying to push it forward.
There was an article in
that going too far and embracing critical thinking can be an uncomfortable thing to do in a specific community. In some places, it can be a dangerous thing to do. Certainly, if you start questioning the authority of an individual who purports to speak on behalf of a deity, you'll be killed in some parts of the world. And so I encourage people, as I wrote in the book, to be realistic about the environment they're in. And, we certainly don't need any atheistic or agnostic martyrs. And so you have to be thoughtful in terms of how far you can go with that. But generally, I think teaching your children not to be biased, not to think better of themselves, and to be more humble as human beings, to work together, is a very good parenting aspect that I do advocate.
Sorry, do you have something else to add? When
we
you
have
confront an issue to which you want to apply critical thinking, are there a series of questions or investigations that you ask yourself or you want to undertake?
You want to do it? I have an answer, but you go ahead.
Well, I think it depends on what I'm doing. I don't have a checklist for trying to evaluate necessarily who I'm going to vote for, which of the 10 candidates I'm going to vote for. There's no checklist. I'm much more organized and methodical if I'm evaluating an investment to recommend to a client. And I want to be really careful here, and I've got a certain series of questions and things I investigate and want to see before it would allow a client to invest in something. So I think how rigid and formulaic it is sort of depends on the situation. I mean, back to the question about raising your children. Fortunately, I'm beyond have to worry about who the two of them marry, because they both married, in my view, very nicely. But I would want them to apply some critical thinking to that. It's not going to be a completely intellectual process, but I would want them to apply some intellectual process to that, and I think they did. But that's a different standard than I apply to determining how I'm going to invest a client's money.
I would answer from a different angle, and obviously we come from different worlds and think in some different ways about these issues. The first thing that I would think of is trying to be sure that I'm not making decisions that are unprincipled. So I first think in terms of trying to be independent-minded as I'm trying to apply critical thinking to an issue. And so I always like to distinguish between loyalty and principle, and I always put principle at a far higher level. I view sort of the idea of making decisions based on loyalty as really the what I learned in Russia by being there during the Putin years as well, as the hallmark of sort of non-critical thinking and of sort of a totalitarian type of mindset. So that's one trick I use for myself, is just to think of the principles I want to use. And second, I often keep in mind it's hard to do, but one of the people who was nice enough to write a blurb for the book on the cover was Soros, and I learned from him something that I find useful, which is to try to disprove my own theories. And it's a very rare skill, I think, to be able to do that on a consistent basis, sort of as you're, to apply it in the stock context. If you're thinking of buying Apple, well, spend some time trying to demonstrate and having people try to demonstrate to you why that's a bad idea, to take a simple example. And most of us, have obviously a bias towards our decision rather than against. And so that's another way, I think, to be sure you're applying critical thinking.
Yeah. Here's a microphone.
So I spent 38 years working in a hospital that's part of a large HMO here in the California. And one of my concerns in the 90s was group meetings where, any kind of critical thinking comes in conflict with the ego personality of the people that are the leaders. And they usually always win out. And then I discovered this electronic technology called interactive keypad technology, where each person could provide some input at various points in the meeting. And they totally rejected it because they didn't like the idea of having anonymous input and losing part of their control. And so it all comes down to, if the leadership doesn't embrace a desire for it, then you're lost.
Yeah, I would only comment that one of the reasons I started the book when I was, in high school or college, I didn't know I was writing a book, but it was because of that issue. My just general negative reaction towards the idea of authority being unchallengeable. And obviously, I saw it mainly in the religious context. I find that a very frightening thing, sort of a totalitarian concept that is even stronger than that which we see in nation-state context. So I agree. It's part of sort of the hierarchical structure that that I do think is problematic as well.
Yeah, the concept of authoritarian leadership suppressing critical thinking. It's not that critical thinking becomes wrong, just not cool to do it. And it's very interesting you raise the hospital in the context of the surgical suite, where the surgeons were always so in charge that if somebody saw a mistake, they were afraid to say something, and that culture is really being addressed. You make a very good point.
It's why authoritarians made both women and slaves never think critically. You don't educate them, you don't try to teach them, because they'll figure out everything real quickly.
Right.
I'm going to raise kind of an elephant that I see in the room. This is a very polite conversation. It's very rational. But at the same time, I feel there's a whole devaluing of critical thinking by our current government. And we are, right this minute, for example, trying to figure out what happened in Iran. What's the reasoning? And I feel there's a real negative value to critical thinking about anything that's going on. So I feel that's the world we live in right now. And without taking a side per se, I'm not here to bash a particular anything, but I'm really struggling because I was a researcher and a scientist, and I am struggling with a world that I feel devalues facts, devalues critical thinking. And I would like to hear any comments that you might have on that situation.
I think that's a good wrap-up question. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll stick my nose out first, and then I can let my two co-panelists have the last word. It seems to me that as the politics has become more and more polarized, then the critical thinking becomes less and less, because it's just, you got to line up with your team. And if you have to line up with your team, then we're not thinking critically. Some philosophy, for lack of a better word, or point of view dominates this group, some dominates that, everybody jump on board. And I think what we might think is a more innocuous example of that I discussed with someone recently was the space program. And when the space program started in the 50s and into the 60s, who supported the space program was across party lines. There were lots of Democrats on both sides. There were lots of Republicans. So they were making their decision, whether it was critically thinking or not, or something other bias. But they were at least weighing factors in determining which side they're on in the space program. Now it's highly partisan. And so I asked this gentleman who works in the space program. I said, well, are we really going to have Americans back on the moon in the next 5 years or so? He said, it depends who wins the election. So if Trump wins, we probably will, and if he loses, we probably won't. So there you go.
Yeah, I would only add, first, thank you for the question. I want to thank also all of you for taking time this evening to come and missing the important, I guess, to most Americans, football game this evening.
Yeah.
The way I think of it is, if you're living in a culture or in a world where people are trained to sort of believe in invisible friends and to have, meaning supernatural beings, and to have, and you're trained during your life basically to follow the orders of people who speak for these deities and to follow authority figures blindly, unquestioning their authority and unquestioning of their rationality of their statements. I think it's a natural thing that over time bleeds into politics, where people are basically of the view that, well, this person is part of my team and does that. So I don't see it as an equal issue, and I know it's a controversial subject, and we're speaking on a recorded thing, and so my friends in the red states will hear it. But I don't think that it's a situation where you have an equal amount of lack of critical thinking in both. I think that places in the world where you have more training to suspend your critical thinking have an easier time going along with an authoritarian figure, and I think that's where we are.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our two experts for this evening, and we thank you for this, and I'm supposed to...
Thank you all. Thank you.
This is the official sound. Everybody,
One last comment that I thought I'd make, because it's interesting that people talk about that there was, sort of less partisanship in the 60s. One of the ideas that we had was a labeling of racial hatred as discriminatory. That's discrimination. It was in the late 60s, early 70s. Discrimination is critical thinking. That's what it is. And racial hatred is something totally different. If you're a critical thinker, you realize color of person's skin has nothing to do with a large range of issues. And if you're not, you don't notice that. So we labeled an emotional problem with it being critical thinking, and we were against it. And I think that has caused us to not like critical thinking ever since. It keeps going down. I think it has affected it. So it's very interesting, because that was an accident in a way. That wasn't an intent by anybody. So things have consequences if we don't think critically enough about what we're doing. But we don't have to be perfect, because that's pretty obvious we're not going to, right?
Just a question for you, George. Do we want to let people know that if the books are signed, but if they want anything more inscribed, such as the 10 Commandments or something, we'll add that in happily for you.
Which 10 Commandments? Or 10-step program? We'll take those. Okay. No, great. Everybody has their books if anybody wants more. I think the easiest thing, if that's true, is you just sit right here while people come up, because it'll be a little easier to move out. And thank you all very much for coming.
thanks. Yeah. Right. Did you go to Dartmouth? Or
I did go to Dartmouth, yeah.
When,